On this episode of Mode 7, you should really go back and watch part 1. Super Mario World had a difficult task to live up to. It had to sell the Super NES to a skeptical world, a world filled with gatekeeping parents who had already spent a whole lot of money on 8-bit Nintendo games and felt those were perfectly fine, and why should they have to spend even more money on a new system that didn't play the old games? Sure, it shared that burden with F-Zero and Pilotwings, and those did a pretty solid job of presenting convincing visual evidence that this new system could do things the old Nintendo never dreamed possible, but both of those games had more of an arcade design mentality about them. They were short, zippy, exciting, and ultimately fairly shallow. I mean, F-Zero didn't even let you race against other players. Once the novelty of those games' visual effects had worn thin, you were left with good, but not amazing games that in some respects felt more shallow than many experiences available on NES. And so it fell to Super Mario World to demonstrate what Super NES could do for intrinsically Nintendo-esque game experiences. By that I mean the console experiences that evolved over the course of the NES's lifetime. Less exciting or visually impressive than contemporary arcade titles, less complex and work-intensive than PC games, but striking a balance of accessibility, speed, and substance. The platonic ideal of Nintendo-esque might actually be exemplified by Capcom's NES-era work. Think Section Z or Bionic Commando. Simple, straightforward arcade titles that their creators redesigned to present new substance and depth on NES. I call those reworkings Nintendo-esque because those overhauled versions tended to be specific to the NES, with other platforms receiving more or less direct adaptations of arcade games. No doubt that had something to do with Nintendo's demand that NES versions of multi-platform games be distinct from other ports, but whatever the business reasons behind this trend, it often resulted in more memorable experiences, or games that offered greater depth and replay value. So while Sega and NEC made their mark with visually stunning and brilliantly faithful arcade adaptations, Nintendo games tended to go a little deeper. And this was Super Mario World's focus: how to enhance those Nintendo-esque experiences with the power of 16-bit hardware. Obviously, they began by giving Super Mario World the best graphics yet seen in a Mario game. That was kind of a given, though. Everyone expected nicer visuals on Super NES, and the whole venture probably would have collapsed in on itself if Super Mario World couldn't look prettier than its NES forebears. Interestingly though, Nintendo didn't really go for flash with Super Mario World. Sure, there are definitely some whiz-bang moments like the massive bonsai bill that fires across the screen in one of the game's 2 possible level 1s. It's like a bullet bill-see, but it fills half the screen. For the most part though, Super Mario World's visual upgrades took a more subtle form, creating a more immersive version of the Mushroom Kingdom, or rather, Dinosaur Island. You had the usual on-trend details like backgrounds featuring multiple levels of scrolling parallax, but these standard tech additions were matched with thoughtful artistry. Yes, Super Mario World included the mandatory 90s more scrolls, but those backgrounds didn't simply have more layers. The expanded color palette of the Super NES allowed Super Mario World's artists to create atmospheric effects, such as a soft blur at the edges of hills in the level backgrounds, rather than the hard black outlines that defined foreground elements. And then you have the ghost houses, eerie worlds which play up the Super NES hardware's transparency capabilities to the max. These levels were drenched with atmosphere, but the ghostly transparencies also allowed for curious vanishing acts and other esoteric challenges that bent and twisted the standard rules of Super Mario games. Water also made use of the hardware's built-in support for transparency, allowing Mario World to rework some of the water hazard stages that appeared in Mario 3 in a more exciting and information-rich way. Now you could clearly see the threats lurking beneath the water surface. Stages could incorporate more large-scale moving hazards and in more dynamic configurations. More enemies could appear on screen at once, and stages could contain far more interactive elements. Bosses made use of the hardware's scaling and rotation features, with certain Koopaling battles taking place on tilting, unstable ground. The challenge now wasn't to stomp them into submission, but rather to make use of the game's physics to bump them off the swinging platforms and into the lava. The game's audio felt just as nuanced and sophisticated as the visuals. Much of the game's music consisted of variations on the main theme, reworked to create different moods: jaunty for standard stages, anxious for athletic stages, moody for underground levels. This was many people's introduction to the Super NES's distinctive audio technology, which made possible warmer, less mechanical sound effects than video games past. Its post-processing effects, or illusions thereof, were great too, such as the reverb on sound effects while in caverns to simulate echo, or the syncopated drum rhythm that blended into the soundtrack whenever the player rode Yoshi. And then you had the layering effects, which came into play in certain castle stages. While Mario had possessed the ability to climb since the very first Donkey Kong, and his second American adventure was conceived in large part as a game about climbing and vertical movement, Mario World greatly enhanced these abilities by allowing our hero to climb freely on large surfaces in which he could scoot along through 360 degrees of motion. Several castle stages featured chain-link fence walls that demanded Mario climb along them in order to advance. Bad guys climbed along both the fencing and the far side of these fences, and Mario could punch through the fence to knock them off. He could also bop their heads from above to defeat them, and since he wasn't technically touching the ground while climbing, this counted toward chain attack modifiers, making it really easy to rack up crazy bonus lives in the process. The most entertaining part of these fence walls, however, was the ability to flip over to the reverse side at certain points, scrambling around in the background. This gimmick would also appear in other early Super NES games like Super Castlevania 4, but Mario World did more with it. It doesn't have a huge impact on how the game plays, but as with so much of this adventure, it's really about the perception of depth and immersion. Obviously, the most important addition the Super NES allowed to the Mario sandbox was Yoshi, who transformed the game's design in a variety of ways. But Mario World's other main boost to its hero skills, the cape, also wouldn't really have worked on NES. On its surface, that may not really seem to be the case. After all, Super Mario Bros. 3 contained a power-up that allowed for flight, and wasn't the cape really just a weirder version of that? Both powers allowed Mario to fly, and both allowed him to perform a physical attack by spinning and hitting bad guys. So same thing, right? No, not at all. The cape gives player a far more intricate and complex tool for flight than the previous game's Raccoon and Tanuki tails. In Super Mario Bros. 3, flight worked along a simple curve. You could gain loft by pumping the jump button while running, and the more quickly you pressed jump, the higher you'd fly. Once you reached the peak of your jump flight, though, you'd unavoidably begin to descend again. Mario couldn't sustain his flight in Super Mario Bros. 3, he could only fall with style. Super Mario World's cape, however, turned flight into a potentially boundless function whose limitations were determined either by the level's edges or your own skills. Where the Raccoon Tail basically presented the idea of flight as really advanced jumping, the cape approaches flying as parasailing. Mario captures air in his cape and it billows behind him. At its most basic level, the cape allows you to fly in the fashion of the Raccoon Tail, a super jump with a similar angle of descent. You don't even have to tap the jump button with this one, just hold it down and Mario activates the cape. To really master the cape, however, you need to use the D-pad to adjust the pitch of Mario's flight. It's almost like a simplified 2D platformer take on a flight sim. By holding up, Mario angles himself upward. Hold down and he lowers his head to point at the ground. Facing upward allows Mario to catch more of a draft in his cape and slow his rate of descent. Meanwhile, angle yourself downward and he'll become streamlined, plummeting toward the ground more quickly. You can use the pitch of Mario's flight in a variety of different ways. Hold down and he'll perform an aerial strike, basically, the precursor to Yoshi's Island butt stomp. The cape definitely requires practice if you hope to master it, but it works because of its versatility. You can use it to get around if you approach it at its most basic level, but if you take the time to learn its nuances, it opens up the game even more than Yoshi does. It's probably worth noting that Super Mario World doesn't actually let you mess around with the cape until you reach World 2, where the Raccoon Tail appeared in Super Mario Bros. 3 World 1-1, serving as a sort of introduction to the game's most important new feature straight away. Here the designers decided to hold it back for a while. And why not? There's already plenty to come to terms with in World 1 of Super Mario World. For starters, the entire concept of separate worlds has largely been discarded for this game. Your adventure takes place across multiple lands that carry a different theme throughout the stages within. But unlike previous Mario games, the idea of the world itself as an isolated set of levels no longer really holds true. Each of Mario World's regions has a castle and a boss at the end, but the traditional requirement that you conquer the lands in sequence no longer really holds true here. The game offers multiple routes to the end, including a shortcut that lets you reach the final boss within less than a dozen stages from the outset. Even the final stage itself reflects this unusual design philosophy. Bowser's castle has two entrances, the dangerous front door and a sneaky back door that lets you bypass most of the stage's threats. There's even one world that consists of two parallel, mutually exclusive paths across a pair of twin bridges, a low route and a high route. At any point, you can backtrack to regions you may have missed previously. In fact, this is practically mandatory if you hope to achieve an all-clear save file. In order to find all 96 exits, you need to complete certain stages multiple times. Thankfully, there's never any question about which stages contain multiple exits. They show up on the world map as flashing red dots, rather than the plain yellow dots of single exit stages. Precisely what you need to do to find alternate exits varies from stage to stage. In some levels, it's totally straightforward. Find a hidden vine or backtrack slightly while carrying a key. But in others, you need to think outside the box. Maybe you need to fly to a seemingly unreachable area, or maybe you need to swim below a seemingly impassable ledge to find a hidden underwater grotto. Super Mario World contains impressive variety, and like the Warp Zone in the original Super Mario Bros., it really puts players' understanding of the game's mechanics and possibilities to the test. It truly does feel like Super Mario Bros. Evolved. And next time on Mode 7, we'll look at the final part of this Super Mario World retrospective.